I'm currently making a Scratch game called Pooshie's World, featuring this small raccoon character named Pooshie. In the last video on this game, I explained the new player physics engine, but I glossed over one key detail, the new collision detection system. Up until the last video, I had been using tiles for my collision, which I explained in the video linked in the top right. But this new engine isn't tile-based, so how is it done? Well, in this video, I want to explain all of that, along with a brand new bonus segment at the end of the video showing how I made some of the special features in Pooshie's world, like how Pooshie manages to match the angle of the slope he's standing on. To start off, I want to explain how I made the player move. Pooshie is a pretty thorough guy. He likes to be super careful about how he moves. What do I mean by this? Well, if Pooshie is moving too fast, he might skip over thin parts of level geometry. That is, on one frame he's on one side of the level geometry, and on the next frame he's completely past it. This can be a huge problem for many games, so what can we do to fix this? Well, in Pooshie's world, I move Pooshie in tiny steps, checking for collisions on each one. These steps are about a pixel in length and ensure that Pooshie won't ever pass over a piece of level geometry. Now, what should we do when we detect that Pooshie is touching something? Most platformers move the player out of the wall in the direction that they moved in, one pixel at a time until they aren't touching the wall anymore. But with this new form of movement, Pooshie is already moving and checking for collisions in 1 pixel increments, so we can move Pooshie back to his last valid step in his movement. This brings up the first common issue in Scratch platformers. Many platformers try to move the player to their last valid position when they touch a wall, floor, or ceiling, or whatever. This doesn't work in this case because the player isn't taking small steps through their entire movement. To understand this, let's look at this example. Let's say that the player is 20 pixels away from the floor and that they have negative 25 vertical speed. When they move down and check for collisions, they notice that they're in the ground, so they move back up to their last valid position. While moving out the same distance you moved in does assure you that you won't be touching the level after a collision, it often causes large gaps between the player and the ground, as seen here. Now for the final part of our basic collision scripts. What do we do after we touch the level? First things first, we reset the player's speed to 0. But what else? Well, we can reset any flag that tells the player to jump if they move down into a collision. Finally, if they move up into a collision, we should stop the player from jumping too. This is it for now, but we'll come back to this later as we start to patch bugs. For our first bug, slopes literally don't work with this engine. The player can't see the difference between a slight incline and a huge wall. The player would stub their toe on this tiny pixel of ground thinking it was a wall. We can easily fix this for slopes on the floor and on the ceiling actually. We can move the player up by a pixel, see if they're still touching the wall, and if they aren't, then we don't run the collision scripts and allow them to keep moving. Just to be safe, we can do this a second time in case the first move wasn't enough, and finally, if the player is still touching the wall, then most likely it's a real wall. So we move back down 2 pixels and run the collision scripts. The same thing can be done for the ceilings, except reversing the up and down movements. While our first bug was that floors were being treated like walls, now walls are being treated like floors. If you very slightly rotate a wall and jump into it, most likely the player will land on a tiny pixel of the rotated wall. Because of this literally tiny bug, many Scratch games limit themselves to boring 90-degree angles, which does not make for very interesting level design. This bug is less commonly fixed in Scratch games, despite it being very easy to implement. We can make a custom block to check to see if what we just landed on is a floor or a tiny wall pixel. We can move to the right 1 pixel and down by 2, and then we can check to see if we're still touching the level. If we aren't, this wasn't really a floor, so we don't run the collision scripts. We can do the same for the left side too, and while this is optional, I also give the player a tiny speed boost to the left or right, so it's more like the player slipping down a steep surface. Finally, we place this slip function in before our collision scripts. If the player starts slipping, we set a flag to tell the collision script not to run, making sure to reset this flag every time the function starts. This function also permits something interesting, hitbox shapes that aren't perfect rectangles. Remember when I jokingly said this? No, they aren't triangles. Well, guess what? The hitbox is kind of a triangle. It's a bit misshapen and it's technically a pentagon, but I digress. Anyways, this new hitbox shape makes the player collide with the level in a much more natural way, along with simulating a very rough center of mass. Now, for our third and final bug, we have slopes again, but this time, instead of the problem being moving up the slope, it comes from moving down the slope. The player starts doing what I like to call slope skipping. In order to fix this, we need to check if there's a floor right below the player when they move. Every time the player moves left or right, we move them down, 1 pixel at a time, for 8 loops. Each loop, we check to see if the player is touching the level. If they are, then we move them up 1 pixel so our collision detection doesn't detect a false collision. If we don't detect anything for all 8 loops, however, we move the player back up 8 pixels to their original position. This fix stops slope skipping completely, keeping the player grounded while moving down the slope. There you go, some nice tips and tricks for you to add to your platformers to make them more fun to play. Before we go to today's bonus segment, let's see what I've been working on since the last devlog. I completely finished the prologue level. This place is meant to be the inside of one of Pooshie's dreams. I won't get too into the story right now, but if you want, here's the story I have so far. There were also a few bugs I found with the moving platforms, and while I don't have any footage of me fixing these bugs, they were mostly from the platforms pushing Pooshie into the level. Platforms can also crush Pooshie, very sad, and they'll also force him into a crouch state when they're right above him. Speaking of crouching, I also added a new hitbox for when Pooshie is crouching, allowing him to slide through small gaps in the level. Now for our little bonus segment before the end of the video. This week's bonus is, how does Pooshie's slope collision detection work? Well, I use a system similar to the one used in Griffpatch's ball physics tutorial, where it is explained very well. But in a nutshell, I use an offset costume and rotate it to find 2 points on the surface of the level. Using the directions of those two collisions, I can take that average, and that's the direction perpendicular to the surface. Anyways, thanks for watching this video. If it helped you, make sure to leave a like and to subscribe to show your support. In the next video, I'll try my hand at a tutorial video. Let's see how that turns out. But yeah, anyways, that's all I've got, and I'll see you all in the next video.